Now, continuing with our topic on the 4th annual joint retreat of the African Union Peace and Security Council and the African Peer Review Mechanism, we're now joined by analyst Nixon Katembo. Nixon, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, this joint retreat, as you've heard there, comes at a time when we see persistence of conflict across the continent. You look at the DRC with the M23 rebels, Central African Republic with the deadly attacks against ethnic Fulani, Sudan. I mean, when we look at Sudan, it's being referred to as the world's worst humanitarian calamity. I could honestly go on. The civil war in Ethiopia, Ghana, Niger, Somalia. Now, this reality makes such a gathering extremely crucial at this time, wouldn't you say?
Well, it's very important to understand the dynamics under which these conflicts happen and the governance lacuna that we find ourselves in on the continent. One of which emanates from the power structure within the continent, particularly the African Union with the peace and security mechanism there that my colleague Kalisha Kumalo talked about. But you have to get a sense that this was within the African peace and security architecture that was designed actually to look at all these holistic issues in a manner that secure the peace and security and the development of the continent. Mm-hmm. But that does happen within the context of global geopolitics, and Africa being central to this, some of these issues in terms of economic aspect. One can not help but question whether the issue of economics vis-a-vis world geopolitics and the governance on the continent are in sync.
Mm-hmm. So at the heart of it, if I'm getting you correctly, you're saying it starts with the AU's peace and security architecture, that it's not adequate. It cannot respond to the issues of today if you look at the geopolitical shift that we're also experiencing.
Certainly, because if you look at, for example, the conflict that have happened in the Sahel region, for example, the issues of terrorism and the subsequent coup d'etat that have happened in the region, those are dictated too by the material condition, geopolitical material condition and economic aspect within a region that have bedevilled those countries for years, but is within a broader framework of geopolitical economic context. And when you look at the issues, for example, the DRC is often taken about as a contest of a lack of political will on the part of the government of the DRC and the ruling elite in that particular country, but also the geostrategic nature of the DRC's importance and vis-a-vis its critical raw materials from that country. Mm-hmm. For example, if you look at it, the DRC produces about 70% of the world copper, which is critical to current world economic advancement in terms of industrial development and, rare mineral resources in terms of any renewable energy production. Mm-hmm. So you look at countries like South Africa, for example, which produce about 80% of the world platinum. So you go along and studying all these issues vis-a-vis the economic factor that informs some of these conflicts. Yeah. Sudan, for example, were major producer of gold on the continent, major producer of oil, but you see the broader contestations that are within the Sudan vis-a-vis the external factor that inform the conflict in Sudan, for example.
So Nixon, you're saying there is an incentive. Right? Pardon me for interjecting there. So you're saying, Nixon, there's an incentive for this kind of conflict. It's economic. That for those who want to characterize some of the conflict that persists on the continent and seem to see it as identity militia or ethnic groupings that mobilize, not necessarily political groupings or just modest civil society organizations that take to the streets, that here there is actually an economic incentive. That's why we see the conflict persisting on the continent. It's not about identity politics here, ethnic identity.
Certainly, mostly ethnic identity and many other issues that relate to governance deficiencies have been used to further conflict, but the real issue is that where you have to follow where the money is, and this is the question of economics. Even the use of guns themselves. You can ask ourselves how many manufacturing industries of guns, for example, on the continent, who benefit from those conflicts. So we have to be having an open mind in terms of the nuances that informs conflict on the continent. For me, the economic part is more central, more than anything else. For example, the Eastern DRC, you heard about the major producer of world cobalt, which then is exported without necessarily benefiting the people of the DRC, and many other rare mineral resources. Now you've heard recently of the signing of the government of the DRC with the Trump administration as an offer to end the conflict in the DRC so that the Trump administration can have control of that mineral resources within the DRC. And we know that China has had an aggressive posture when it comes to mineral exploitation in the DRC and many other parts of the continent. The coup in Guinea-Conakry, for example, that happened early 2001, it was informed by the discovery of the large iron ore deposit, of which China, together with Russia, was building a railway from Mountain Simandu to the ports of Guinea-Conakry. So these are issues that are not often talking about in the real terms, in terms of understanding where the real basis for the conflict on the continent.
So you reckon these are the uncomfortable conversations that need to be had, that you have to have the AU willing at this point to have the conversation, the Peace and Security Council and the APRM, to have the conversation around who stands to benefit if conflict persists on the continent. And then perhaps the conversation will take them beyond this continent and to the West possibly. And then how do they deal with it once they arrive at that conclusion? Because history and the research shows that there are some outside of the continent that stand to benefit with this conflict. So what do they do then when the conversation leads them to that conclusion that it's people or certain interests outside of Africa?
So if you look at the peace and security architecture of the African continent, I mean the AU, it talks about regional economics, regional communities, and harmonization of policies in terms of how the regional economic community interact with each other in terms of the stabilization and the economic development. So once you deal with that, I don't think that when there is a creation of employment, young people will be lured to enter into conflicts. But also, those economic development and incentives must trickle down to the people, but also within the broader context of the international economic structures that seeks to benefit the continent more, rather than just being developing a sort of an extractive industry on the part of the continent to benefit the West that you talked about. And often when we talk about the peace and security, we do not align that with the economic issues that are central to the stability of the continent, to the socio-economic prosperity of the continent, and therefore assist in alleviating some of the conflict hotspots that
Nixon,
could have
just before we close,
on the continent.
Pardon me again for interjecting, just in the interest of time, just before we close, what happens then to those who are considered to be the agents, the enablers, those that have infiltrated these spaces? You'll have these meaningful conversations now where we're looking for African solutions to the African problems. You go back, these member states go back, they go back to their countries, but in those countries you still have Africans who are agents that allow this economic or political system to thrive or continue, what some would refer to as the comprador bourgeoisie. What happens in that respect? Because there are those where you will have ones looking to see or enable transformation while there are agents within them that want to ensure that the status quo remains.
I think certainly you're right on point to look at the issue of a comprador bourgeoisie that are on the continent. And I think because of the institutional framework that we have not developed sufficiently enough on a continent to deal with such matters. That's all often create a governance failure that deals with the matters of the continent in a manner that would have benefited not just the comparable bourgeoisie that we have in the power structures, but it trickle down to the masses, and the responsiveness that comes within the society itself to hold those in power to account whenever they see that they have gone astray from the ideal of the society and the economic development that the continent seeks to achieve.
Nixon, thank you very much for an insightful conversation. That's analyst Nixon Katembo speaking to us there.